Have you ever walked into a room and felt like you shouldn't be there for no reason? There was nothing you could see or hear that made you want to stay. You wanted to leave because of something longer than words that told you to. You might understand what I'm about to say if you have. Also, if you haven't, stay with me tonight because this story might change your mind. I need to know something before we start. Where are you sitting to listen? Enter it in the box below. I always want to know where the people who hear these stories are. If you're in bed with the lights off, on a lonely highway, or in a room that seems a little too quiet all of a sudden. Explain, I need to know. Let me take you back now. It was 1891. A valley was hidden deep in the Appalachians, in a part of the land that most maps of the time didn't try to number. The people who lived in the several spread homesteads along. The ridgeline called it Hollow Creek, but no one could remember why. There was a stream. As expected, there was a thin ribbon of dark water that wound through the valley's lowest point before going deep into a cave system that no one had ever fully planned out. But people couldn't explain the word hollow. Some people said it was because of how sound went down there. You could scream, but nothing would come back. There is no echo or back. It felt like the valley ate your voice in its entirety and kept it to itself. A house stood at the very end of this valley, against a mountain full of hemlock and black oak trees. It wasn't a house. There wasn't a farm there. It was something that tried to be big but failed. 3 stories of hand-cut limestone and wood frame, with tall windows that didn't reflect light even when the sun hit them straight on. The porch went around the front and one side of the house. The boards were bent and creaking from the weight of the porch. The roof had. It used to be slate, but years of ice and little use had worn it away in spots, leaving dark holes that looked like teeth missing. In the valley, people called it the house, but it didn't have a real name. The person who lived there was named Purnell Osgood. It was hard for door frames to fit Purnell, who was 53 years old and very tall. His frame used to be strong but had become weak over time. He worked hard for decades, so his hands were huge and his fingers were swollen. His face was carved and angular like someone who had spent all of his years spent outside. His eyes were as gray as creek water in November so light that it was hard to tell what color they were. He came to Hollow Creek by himself with a wagon full of tools and lumber in 1876, 15 years before the events I'm about to describe. He didn't say a word about why he chose the most remote valley in the county to make a life for himself. He worked as a stonemason and was a good one. He could look at a rock face and figure out what wall it was supposed to support. Become. Over the course of 3 years, he built the manor himself. He got all the stones from a quarry he dug in the hillside behind the house and all the wood from the nearby forest. He then put each piece together with such accuracy that the few people who saw it found it almost disturbing. They said it was too beautiful and planned out. It looked like every stone had always been meant to be there, like Purnell had seen the house in his mind before he even put down the first block. 15. It was years that Purnell lived alone in that house. He didn't talk to anyone. About 7 miles to the north was the closest town, which was a loose group of buildings called Judkin's Crossing. He went there once a month to trade stonework for supplies. He didn't say much. Even though he wasn't mean, he had a cool air about him that made people feel awkward. The way a hallway door that is closed makes you feel uneasy when all the other doors are open. You have no idea what's going on. You're not sure if you want to. The people. People in Judkin's Crossing had ideas, of course. They always do. Some people thought Purnell was running away from a woman, a bill, or a crime. People who knew him better said he was just a man who liked stones over people, and who could blame him. People could be mean. Some of the older people who still believed in such things said Purnell hadn't really picked Hollow Creek. That he was picked by the valley. One person knew Purnell better than everyone else, if the word better even makes sense. Petrus was his name. Growl lived in a weathered cabin on a ridge above the valley, about 2 miles north of the Manor. He was the closest thing Hollow Creek had to a friend. Phesis was 61 years old, short and wiry. His beard had turned white by the time he was 45, and his hands shook a little even when he was quiet. When he was younger, he worked as a miner in the mountains to get coal. One day, a tunnel collapse hurt his back and it never fully recovered. He walked with a clear tilt to thee. He left, as if he were always holding himself against a wind that no one else could feel. At that time, in Appalachia, Phesis was thought to be the most moral person because he took care of his own goats, a small farm, and other activities. Phesis was the first person to notice that things had changed. It was October 1891, and fall had come early and hard that year. The leaves changed quickly, almost overnight, from green to a deep, bruised red that made the hills look like they were bleeding. It had been cooler for weeks before, and there was frost in the mornings that looked like snow. A goat path led Phesis to a spot on the ridge where he could see into the valley and catch a glimpse of the manor's roof through the trees in the morning. The chimney was giving off smoke. That was fine. The first stream of smoke was thicker and lighter, and it came from behind the house near the old quarry. He looked at it for a long time. He knew that Purnell burned brush or pieces of wood from time to time. That way again. This smoke was different, though. It was too dark and still, and there was a smell that went all the way up the hill. It was faint, but clear. It had an old penny smell, like copper that had been left out in the rain. There was nothing to it, Phesis told himself. After going back to his lodge, he didn't think about it again for 3 days. He took a handsaw back to the house when he went down there. Phesis's cabin to Purnell's land was about a 40-minute walk down a narrow path that went around and around. First, a thick forest and then a flat area near the creek. Phesis had walked this path many times over the years. He knew every way, every stone, and every turn in the road. But something was different that morning. He wasn't sure what to say. The trees looked the same. It was the same trail. The creek was making its normal soft sound. The air was still clean, but something had changed. More dense and heavy, like the valley had taken a breath and was holding it. He got to the house just before noon. It was strange that the front door was open. Purnell was very picky about his doors. It was Phesis who spoke from the porch. Nothing. He called again. Nothing. He went inside. That's how clean the house always is. Purnell took care of it with the same care he used to build it. Every surface is clean, and all the tools are where they belong. At the far end of the main floor was a stone fireplace, and in the middle was a long table. Along the walls were shelves that held tools, books, and other goods. The fire it was cool outside, but the stones were still warm. It smelled like wood smoke and something else. That same copper smell was almost invisible, like a memory of a smell rather than the thing itself. The two men met in the back of the house, in a room that Phesis had never been in before. Behind a door that had always been shut, it was on the first floor. It was now only a few inches wide, and Phesis could see lamplight flashing against the stone walls through the opening. The door was opened by him. He thought the room would be bigger, but it was only 12 feet by 12 feet, but the walls were covered from floor to ceiling with writing that wasn't on paper but in stone. There were letters, symbols, and what looked like maps cut into the stone. All of them were cut into the rock with the same exactness that Purnell used in everything he built. There were English words carved into some of the stones. Some were written in a language Phesis didn't understand. There were also words that were nothing but patterns, swirls, angles and shapes that kept showing up in ways that made his eyes want to move away, as if his sight was rejecting them. What it saw. She was sitting on a wooden stool in the middle of the room and facing the far wall. When Phesis came in, he didn't turn around. He didn't move at all. He was just sitting there with his big hands on his knees and looking at a part of the wall where the carvings were more crowded and disorganized, overlapping in a way that looked almost crazy. He said his name. Purnell didn't answer. Phesis said it much louder this time. Nothing. He turned around to face him. The eyes of Purnell were open. His face was relaxed, but his eyes were. Phesis later said that Purnell's eyes looked like empty windows in a house. No one was at home. Even though the body was still there, breathing and blinking every once in a while, what made Purnell who he was had moved on to something else, somewhere far away. Phesis put his hand on his shoulder. Purnell slowly blinked, like a man coming up from the water. He turned his head and looked at Phesis as if he had never seen him before. "How long have you been here?" he asked. From Phesis, Purnell looked around the room and then back at him. He asked, "What day is it?" Then Purnell said, "Thursday." He was quiet for a moment. "I started on Monday," he said. 3 days. He had been sitting there for 3 days. Let me take a moment to pause because this is the part of the story where most people start to try to make sense of what's going on. I understand why you feel that way. Perhaps Purnell was sick. He may have been sick, had an episode, or took a break with. Truth that science at the time couldn't explain. After living alone in that valley for 15 years, he might have finally given up after all the time. All of those are plausible options. I might agree with you if this were the end of the story. It's not the end, though. It's only the beginning. Also, the fear behind you brought you this news. Don't forget to subscribe to the station if you like this. Press that bell to make sure you don't miss the next one. Also, if you're listening on a different station, know that they stole our work without our permission. Tell us about it. Thanks for everything. Let's go back to Hollow Creek. Phesis led Purnell out of the room and into the house's main area. He made him eat and drink. Purnell did what he was told like a man who was following directions in a language he didn't fully understand. He ate in an automatic way. Even though he drank what he was told, his eyes kept going back to the path that led to that room. He was asked about the drawings by Phesis. Bynell stayed quiet for a long time. He then said something to Phesis that he would remember for the rest of his life. "I didn't cut them," Purnell added. "I woke up Monday morning, and they were there, all of them, and I've been sitting in that room trying to understand them ever since." "But you built this house," Phesis added. "That room has been there since you laid the stones." "The room has been there," Purnell said. He didn't know what to say when they said, "The carvings have not." It took him a few hours to get back to his cabin before it got dark. During that time, he made sure Purnell ate again. He told himself that Purnell had carved the walls while he was in a dream state, where his body worked but his mind was somewhere else. It was the only answer that made sense, but as Phesis walked back up the hill, he saw something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Now the smell was stronger. The smell of copper had grown stronger and became more like something sweet and natural. It was no longer just near the house. It was in the valley, in the air between the trees, and in the frost on the ground. It seemed like it had filled the whole hollow. He went back to the house 4 times in the next 2 weeks. Each time, things got worse, but not in a big way that would make someone call the police or the doctor from across the mountain. Instead, things got worse slowly, in ways that built up like snow. 3 days after the room, the first day, it looked like Purnell was mostly himself again. He was cutting stone in his quarry, moving slowly and carefully as usual, But he had started a new job. He was building a wall that wasn't connected to the house. It wasn't a fence or a boundary marker. It was a wall that stood alone and was about 6 feet high and 20 feet long, curving gently about 50 yards from the back of the manor. He told Phasis, "It needs to be there," when he was asked what it was for. The wall was still there on the second visit a week later. It was much longer than what one man, even one as skilled as Purnell, should have been able to build in that time. It was now curved almost all the way around the back of the house. Purnell had also built a second wall inside the first one, making a small passageway between them. The hall was just barely big enough for one person to walk through. Purnell put a big, flat stone at the end, where the two walls almost met. It could be an altar, a table, or a barrier, depending on how you looked at it. Check it out. 10 days later, on the third visit, Purnell looked different. He was still eating, but he had dropped weight. His clothes seemed to be made for a bigger man because they hung off of him. His big, strong hands had started to shake. It wasn't like Phasis's tremor, which was steady and had a medical reason. It seemed like Purnell's body was getting small electrical shocks at random times because his shaking came on quickly and went away just as quickly. His eyes had changed too. The light gray had. He looked even lighter, almost see-through, like a man looking through his own eyes at something behind them, which was disturbing. Things changed in a way that couldn't be explained on the fourth visit, which happened 2 weeks after the room. He got to the house early in the afternoon. The sky was cloudy, dark, and gray, the kind of fall sky in the Appalachians that sits on top of the ridges like a lid on a pot. There was no sound in the air at all. There is no wind and no birdsong. The creek should have been. It was quiet enough to hear from the front porch. It was Phasis who stood on the porch and watched. Nothing. He had lived all his life in these mountains. There was real quiet before, the kind that happens at 3 a.m. when even the bugs have stopped moving. But this wasn't like that. This quiet was rough and heavy. It hurt his ears like the change in pressure before a storm. It wasn't that there was no sound. It was something else being there that had taken its place. He went inside. The house was empty. It was cold by the fire. The room with the carvings had an open door. Phelis forced himself to look inside. People saw more of the carvings. They were now on the floor, the ceiling, and the walls as well. Symbols, words, and designs that seemed to move in the lamplight and shift around the edges of his vision like something alive. And something new was added. There was a small hole in the middle of the floor where the stool had been. It was about 2 feet across and exactly round, with very smooth edges. Even though that wasn't possible with a machine in 1891, they looked like they were cut by one. The hole got smaller. He looked at it while he leaned over it. He couldn't see the bottom. He picked up a piece of stone from the ground and put it in. That's 1 second, 2, 5, 10. He didn't hear it hit. Phasis came out of the room. He turned around and went around the back of the house where the walls Purnell had been building faced the quarry. What he saw there stopped him in his tracks. Both walls of the room were done. It made a full circle, now a spiral that curled inward like a nautilus shell. The narrow passageway got narrower and narrower until it reached the center, where the flat stone was sitting. But the circle was so big that Purnell could not have built it in 2 weeks, even if he worked non-stop. Stones had been put together so precisely that you couldn't fit a blade of grass between them. It was at least 100 feet across, and each and every stone was carved. The same signs and the same. Like a language written on skin, the designs cover every surface. Right at the start of the spiral, Purnell was standing there with his back to Phasis and looking inward. His name was called by Phasis. Purnell slowly turned around, and Phasis saw that his lips were moving, but he wasn't talking. They were just moving, making shapes or words without making a sound. His eyes were that horrible clear gray color, and the shaking was now steady in both hands. His fingers were moving back and forth as if they were still carving, even though they weren't. There was nothing under them but dirt. It was Phesis who asked Purnell again, "What have you done?" Purnell had a smile. It wasn't a comforting phrase. The man's smile showed that he knew the answer to a question he should not have asked in the first place. Bernell said, "It's under there. It has been under there the whole time. What has the house, the valley, everything? I built on top of it without knowing. I've lived on top of it for 15 years, and it's been awake the whole time, just sleeping. Just listening while I wait." "What are you talking about?" Someone really looked at him, and Fesa thought he saw something in those pale eyes for a split second. No crazy thoughts or misunderstanding. Sureness. The kind of sureness that breaks a man because the mind isn't made to hold it. He said, "Come with me," or Scottishly, "Let me show you. I have a question for you now. Has there ever been a time when your body told you to leave, but your mind, your interest, or that stubborn? The need to know drove you forward. What would you have done? Would you have gone after him? Post your answer below." Phesis could have done something else. He did it. He went into the circle with Purnell. Phesis sometimes had to turn to get through the small space between the walls. The carved stones on both sides rose up above him and were close enough for him to touch. The light changed as he went deeper into the circle. It wasn't really dim, but it did seem like it was going through something. It looked like the gray sky was farther away. With each turn, as if the spiral went deeper than its wall should have let it go. Now the smell was too strong. It was no longer as sweet as copper. It was now deeper and more complicated. It smelled like lightning hit the ground. It had a smell of iron that was wet. It smelled like something very old that had just been opened for the first time. When they got to the thin circle of sky above them, the light from the flat stone in the middle let Fesa see what Purnell had seen. Done. The flat stone was moved out of the way. Under it, there was another hole that was bigger than the one in the room. It was 5 tons across, or maybe 6 tons, and had the same sides that couldn't be clean. Moving air came out of the hole in a steady, regular way, like a pulse. Warm air rose from the ground and carried that smell of old minerals and sound from below. Phesis had to hold his breath to hear the sound coming from deep below. It wasn't a voice or a machine, but something between a hum and a roar, a vibration that felt like the sound of a bell that had been rung days ago and was still slowly letting out its tone. It came from the ground, the walls, and even the air. That wasn't a mistake. It had a pattern and a beat, like something was talking to it. He took a step back from the hole. His body made the choice for him. No matter what his interest wanted, his legs were already moving, pushing him backwards. That hole in the ground. He told Purnell that we had to leave. Nobody moved but Purnell. Looking down into the hole, he had a look of complete peace on his face. His hands were no longer shaking. Phesis said that the strange clarity in his eyes had grown into something that felt like recognition. It was like Purnell was seeing something he had always known was there. Purnell said in a low voice, "It's not what you think. It's not bad or dangerous. It's just been here longer than I thought it would be." He pointed out the valley, the creek, the hills, the stone, and the house. "It's all part of it. I didn't choose this place, Phesis. I thought I did, but I didn't. Something brought me here. Something needed me to open this." Phesis didn't stay to hear more. He backed out of the spiral as fast as the narrow corridor would allow, rubbing his shoulders against the carved walls and feeling the symbols press against him. He walked out into the gray afternoon light instead of running, because running made him think of something he wasn't ready to think about. He walked steadily and deliberately up the trail to his cabin and didn't look back. That night, Thesis couldn't sleep because of the sound, that low, rhythmic hum. He could still hear it faintly, as if it had followed him up the ridge, or as if hearing it once had tuned his ears to a frequency they couldn't turn off. He lay in bed in the dark, listening to it pulse under the silence of the mountain night, and he tried to tell himself it was all in his head. He almost believed it until the goats started bleeding. Just before dawn, all of the goats in his pen started bleeding at the same time. These weren't their normal sounds. They were the sounds goats make when they smell a predator. Thesis grabbed his lantern and went outside. The goats were shaky and pressed up against the far side of the pen, as far away from the valley as they could get. He could see the shaking in the lamplight because they were all facing the same way down the slope towards the manor. Thesis raised his lantern and looked. The valley was glowing, but not with light because there was no flame or lamp. Instead, the mist that had settled in the hollow was glowing, a pale, greenish-white glow that hugged the ground and moved in slow, steady steps. The glow was strongest near the manor, and Thesis could see the spiral from where he stood on the ridge. In the dark, lit by that impossible luminescence, it looked like what it was, a pattern, a signal, something carved into the earth's surface to send a message to whatever lay below it. The glow lasted until dawn, but by the time the sun rose over the eastern ridge, it was gone. The mist had burned off, and the creek murmured as if nothing had happened. The goats calmed down and went back to eating. Thesis told himself that it was swamp gas, phosphorescence, or some other natural event that the mountains caused that he had never noticed before. He almost believed it. For the next 3 days, Thesis didn't go down to the manor. Instead, he stayed on his ridge and took care of his garden and fed his goats. He tried very hard not to listen for the noise. There was a hum that he could never quite make out, like a thought he couldn't quite form. On the 4th day, a man named Odell Burkhardt came up to Thesis' cabin on a mule. Odell was the closest thing Judkins Crossing had to a constable. He was 45 years old, thin and weathered, and he chewed the inside of his cheek when he was thinking. He had come because Purnell had missed his monthly supply run, which had never happened in 15 years. Thesis told Odell what he had seen, but not what he had heard. He told him about the room, the carvings, the spiral, and the hole. He also told him about Purnell's behavior, the weight loss, the tremor, and the strange things he'd said. Odell listened quietly and chewed his cheek steadily. When Thesis was done, Odell was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'll ride down and check on him." "Don't go alone," Thesis said. Odell looked at him. "You want to come?" Some parts of Thesis said no, but then he thought about Purnell, sitting at the edge of that hole, calm, sure, and by himself, and something in him said yes. He would spend years wishing he had ignored that part of him. Odell rode down with Thesis on his back because he couldn't ride. The trail and trees were the same, but Thesis noticed that the smell of copper was back and stronger than before. It had a new quality to it that was organic and almost floral-like. When they got to the manor in the middle of the day, the front door was locked. Odell knocked, but no one answered. He knocked again, louder, but still no answer. They went around the back and saw that the spiral was still there, but it had changed. The stones, which Thesis had last seen as raw limestone, were now dark and stained, as if something had seeped up from the ground and saturated them from below. The carvings, which had been pale cuts in gray stone, now stood out. In the middle of the day, the dark lines stood out against the darker stone, and they seemed to pulse faintly, like veins under skin. And the air above the spiral was moving, but it wasn't wind. It was distorted, like air above a hot road in the summer, bending the light and making the trees and sky behind it waver and ripple as if seen through water. But it wasn't hot. It was colder near the spiral than the rest of the area. Both men could see their breath. Since it was hot enough for Odell's mule to sweat, he yelled toward the entrance to the spiral. His voice hit the stone walls and died. There was no echo, no resonance, just nothing. It was the same soundless void that gave the valley its name. Odell led Phesis into the spiral. The corridor was smaller than Phesis remembered, but he knew that wasn't possible because the walls hadn't moved. They couldn't move, but the carving seemed closer, denser, and more complicated. It wasn't in the air this time, it was through the stone under their feet. They felt a steady rhythmic pulse that went up through the soles of their boots and into their bones. It was the same rhythm Phesis had heard before, but it was stronger, more insistent, more like a heartbeat. When they got to the center, the flat stone and hole were still there, but Purnell wasn't. Odell knelt at the edge and looked down, stayed back and pressed his palms against the carved walls behind him, feeling the symbols vibrate. "There's a light," Odell said. Phesis didn't want to look, but he did. Down below, where no natural cave should go because of the rock formations, there was a faint, blue-white light that pulsed in perfect sync with the vibrations in the stone. It didn't cast shadows or reveal walls, it just existed as a point, a source, something separate from everything else, shining in the dark like a star buried in the earth. And moving slowly around it were shapes that were not rocks or formations, but shapes with geometry, angles and curves that repeated, mirrored, and folded in on themselves in ways that the human eye saw as patterns. The human mind couldn't put them into groups, but they moved with purpose and rhythm. "Where is Purnell?" Odell stood. Phesis whispered, "Rise up." He had a pale face. The biting of the cheeks had stopped. Phesis could see that his hands were shaking because they were by his sides. "We need to get people up here," Odell said. His voice was calm and steady, like a man who has decided that staying calm is the only thing that will keep him from feeling something he can't afford to feel. "We need to get a proper party together. Ropes, lanterns, men who know caves." They left the spiral and shut the back door of the manor, but neither of them could have said why. They didn't say a word as they walked back to the trail and toward Judkin's Crossing. On the way back, Phesis noticed two things. First, the goats on the ridge above, which could be seen as white dots against the brown hillside, were all standing still at the farthest point of their pasture, facing the valley. Second, the smell of copper had changed again. It was sweeter, almost pleasant, and Phesis realized this with a slow, creeping horror that hit him like cold water. Odell got a group of 6 men from Judkin's Crossing together. It took 2 days because the men had to find someone to take care of their farms, and because most of them needed to be persuaded. The mountains had always had stories, dark, old stories about things that happened in the hollows and under the hills that the settlers had heard from the people who lived there before them. Most men listened to these stories with respect, but they didn't really want to believe them. When Odell talked about what he had seen, the stories seemed closer, more real, and more like warnings than myths. The group left on the morning of the 3rd day, with Odell and Phesis joining the other 6 men. They brought ropes, lanterns, tools, and 2 rifles, but no one could say what they were going to shoot. It was a clear day, one of those crisp autumn mornings in the Appalachians where the air is so clear it seems like you can see forever. They got to the manor around noon. The house was empty, and the spiral was still standing in the back. The air above it was still distorted and cold, but there was something new. The ground around the spiral, a ring of bare earth about 20 feet from the outside wall, had changed color. It was darker than it should have been, almost black. When one of the men, a 40-year-old farmer named Guthrie Vance, built, he bent over like a barrel, put his hand on it, and quickly pulled it back. "It's warm," he said. "The ground is warm." It wasn't too hot to burn, but it was warm in the way that a living body is warm. It gave off a steady, even heat that had nothing to do with the sun, the season, or any natural process that these men knew about. The group went into the circle one at a time. An alley with 8 guys was just barely wide enough for one. The images on the walls looked like they were watching them go by. There were a lot of symbols, but they were more ordered than before. It was like the chaos Phesis had seen before was turning into order, into a grammar, into something that was trying very hard to be read. They got to the middle, the light, the hole. It was still very deep and too far down to be real, but it was brighter now, and the shapes around it were clearer and more defined. They moved in patterns that several of the men later said reminded them of how flocks of birds move without sharing notes. Adding noise, 1,000 separate parts moving together as one in response to a signal that they could all feel but not see. Down went a lantern on a rope. It went down 50, 100, and 200 feet. Even though the lamp was almost out of sight, the smooth, carved walls of the shaft could still be seen in its light. The same symbols ran all the way down in a spiral that matched the one above ground. The lantern got to the 300-foot end of the rope, but there was still no bottom. It was only the steady blue-white light below, and the shapes moving in their quiet circles that could be seen. The light was put back up. The stone's beat changed as it rose. It got faster. Not a lot, not enough to feel like a danger, just enough to make you aware. The steady pulse, which had been following the slow heartbeat, sped up a bit, like a person waking up and realizing someone is watching them. All of the men in that circle could feel it. A number of them touched the walls and then pulled them away. Not since. The stone felt alive, not because it was hot, cold, or sharp, nor because it was a metaphor or a poem. The stone felt like it had a pulse, and the patterns looked like they let something flow through the rock. An unassuming man named Reich Moy, 32, stepped away from the group and leaned his ear against the wall. He used to work for the train but had lost 3 fingers on his left hand in an accident with a coupling. He now works as a carpenter. He did that for about 30 seconds. He then stood up straight. His face had gone all the way white. "It's talking," he said. Odell asked, "What?" 3 other men put their ears to the wall, but 2 of them didn't hear anything. The third, Farmer Guthrie Vance, pulled back with the same blank look on his face as Reich. "He's right, Guthrie. There's something down there," he said. There was no talking or arguing as the 8 men walked out of the stone corridor and into the open air. Each of them took a deep breath as if they had been under water. Odell made the decision. They would seal the hole. They would do this with stone, mortar, and anything else they could find. They would leave this place and not come back. It took all day, and they used stones from Purnell's quarry, which was kind of a dark irony. First, they filled the hole in the spiral with rubble and capped it with flat stone sealed with mortar that Guthrie mixed from supplies in Purnell's workshop. Then, they went inside and sealed the hole in the carved room. While they were working on the second hole, something happened that none of them talked about afterward. Not with each other, not with their wives, and not with anyone else. It was as if they had. They all agreed in silence to take it out of the record of that day. The carvings moved, but not so dramatically that they would scream or drop their tools. Instead, the symbols on the walls moved slowly, like letters moving around on a page. The spirals got tighter, and the angles changed. And for a split second, or maybe 2, or maybe 3, the whole room full of carvings came together to form a single image. A face. Not a human face, not an animal face, but a face in the same way that a mountain with 2 caves and a ridge between them can look like a face. It was there, clear and huge, looking at them from the walls, the floor, and the ceiling all at the same time. Then it was gone. The carvings went back to being jumbled. The men sealed the hole and left the room. They sealed the manor's doors and windows with Purnell's own mortar, tools, and stone, making the house look like a tomb. They went back to Judkins Crossing but never went back to Hollow Creek. Purnell Osgood was never found. There was no body, no belongings, and no sign of where he had gone or what had happened to him. The county reported him missing. His property, which had no heirs or claimants, went back to the county and was left alone. No one wanted it, and no one went near it. The trail from Judkins Crossing to Hollow Creek slowly grew overgrown. After 10 years, you wouldn't have known it was ever there. But the story doesn't end there. In 1897, 6 years later, a surveyor named Calhoun Driscoll was mapping the area for a timber company. He was working alone, which wasn't common for surveyors in that area, but the company was trying to save money, and Calhoun was young and sure of himself, 28 years old, thin with sharp features because he had never met anything he couldn't measure, calculate, or explain. He found the valley and the creek. It led to the manor, where the seals on the doors were still in place and the mortar was strong. But the walls, Purnell's original walls, the ones he had worked on for 15 years by himself, were cracked. These weren't cracks caused by weather or settlement. The cracks went through the stones themselves, splitting them along lines that followed the carvings, as if the symbols had been stress points the whole time, fault lines waiting for enough pressure to break. And from those cracks, a faint blue-white light pulsed steadily. He marked the spot on his map and wrote a short note about it in his survey log, but he didn't go inside. Later, in a letter to his boss, he said that the place made his compass behave strangely. The needle wouldn't settle. It kept turning in slow circles, always clockwise, as if it were being pulled by something stronger than north. The timber company decided not to harvest that valley. The official reason was that the terrain was too difficult for logging operations. According to unofficial company records that were found decades later, the reason was that 3 different survey teams sent to confirm Calhoun's findings all reported the same thing: a broken compass, a strange reluctance to enter the valley, and a smell of copper and sweetness that made no one want to accept the welcome. In 1912, a geological survey of the area noticed that Hollow Creek had a strange seismic profile. The instruments picked up A. It sounded like a steady, low-frequency vibration coming from deep below the valley floor. It didn't match any known geological process, like tectonic activity, underground water movement, or mineral composition. The author of the survey said it sounded like the Earth itself was sending a signal regular, structured, and purposeful. He suggested more research be done, but it wasn't. In 1938, a hiker got lost in the mountains and ended up in the valley. There was a woman named Corbth Fenwick, 36, who had grown up in the area and knew the mountains better than anyone alive. She found the manor. The house had been mostly taken over by the forest by that point, almost 50 years after it was sealed. Trees had grown through the porch, and vines had grown over the walls, but the structure was still sound. Purnell's stonework had held. Corbth wrote in her journal that the valley was unusually quiet, with no birds, bugs, or wind. She also wrote down the smell, that she said smelled like a hot ring mixed with wildflowers. She also noticed that her watch stopped when she entered the valley and didn't start again until she left. One more thing she noticed. In the back of the property, through the bushes, she could see a stone spiral. At the entrance to the spiral, a single stone, brand new and unweathered, stood upright and perfectly balanced on its base, despite being nearly 5 tons tall. It wasn't there in 1891, and no one has been known to have put it there in the years since. It just showed up like a message on a doormat. Corbth took a picture of it and rubbed some of the carvings together. She left the valley and went back to civilization, where she showed her findings to a professor at a university whose name has been lost to history. The professor looked at the rubbings for a few weeks and came to the conclusion that he said that the symbols didn't match any known writing system, decorative tradition, mathematical or astronomical notation. He thought they were either the work of a very creative mind or the result of something that his field wasn't equipped to study. Korbth returned to Hollow Creek again in the spring of 1939 with a camera, proper surveying gear, and a friend, a man whose name she never wrote down in her journal but only called M. They went down into the valley together and found the manor, the spiral, and the carved stone exactly where it had been the year before. But they also found something new. The creek that had always gone underground near the manor was flowing differently this time. Instead of going down into the ground, it was flowing toward the spiral, which was not its normal path. It was going against the slope of the land, pulling toward the stone walls as if it were being pushed by a force stronger than gravity. Following the same path that Phesis, Odell, and the 8 men had walked decades before, the water entered the spiral corridor and wound its way inward along the narrow passage between the 2 walls. Korbth followed the water to the center. The flat stone had been moved again, pushed aside by something from below, and the hole that the men had sealed with rubble and mortar in 1891 was wide open. All of the stones and mortar that they had packed into it were gone, and the shaft was clean and smooth, as if it had never been there. The water from the creek was flowing into it, falling silently into the blue-white light that still pulsed, glowed, and breathed in the darkness below. M. Korbth's friend leaned over the edge and looked down. He stood there for a long time. When he stood up, he had a look on his face that Korbth later described in the last entry she ever wrote in her journal, as someone who had just realized that everything they had thought was true. What they thought they knew about the world was so oversimplified that it might as well have been a lie. He told them to leave, and they did. Korbth never went back to Hollow Creek. That was the last entry in her journal, which was found years later in a box of personal effects. There was no explanation or closing thought. It was just a description of what she saw and then nothing. I want to say something. This story has been told in pieces by different people for more than 100 years. Hollow Creek came away with pieces. Phesis and Odell each got their own. The surveyors, geologists, and Korbth all saw and felt something and then left. No one had the whole picture. Maybe no one can have the whole picture because whatever is under that valley is too big, too old, or fundamentally different for humans to understand. But I'll tell you what we do know. Purnell Osgood built a house on top of something. We know that the mountain spoke to him through stone, through symbols, and through a language carved into its bones. It pulled him down, not violently or maliciously, but with the same slow, steady force that pulls water downhill. It just claimed him, the way the earth claims everything in the end, only faster and with more purpose. We also know that the hole cannot be sealed. Every attempt to do so has been undone, not by force or destruction, but by simple negation, as if the stones and mortar. We know the vibration is still going on, because in 1958, a seismological station 40 miles from Hollow Creek recorded a steady low-frequency signal coming from below the valley. The researchers who looked into it called it strange, unexplained, and structurally complex. One of them wrote in a footnote that was later taken out of the published paper that the signal statistically resembled speech. We know this. Someone always makes it into that valley, whether it's a hiker, a surveyor, or a hunter who got lost. Every year, they all say the same things: the silence, the smell, the warmth of the ground, and the feeling that the valley is not empty, but full of something that can't be named or seen. It's always there, and every year the carved stone at the entrance to the spiral changes. It has new symbols and patterns, as if whatever is down there is still writing. No one knows what happened to Purnell Osgood because his body was never found, and there is no grave. He was never seen leaving the county or in any other town after October 1891. And there is no record of him being anywhere else in the world. But there are carvings on the walls of a house that still stands in a valley that most maps don't name. The symbols are still there, and if you press your ear to the stone and hold it, you can hear them. People say that if you hold your breath and listen with all your might, you can hear it. It's not words or a voice, but something older, something deeper, a rhythm, a pulse, a pattern that keeps happening in the dark beneath the mountains. It's not random, and it hasn't stopped. Phesis Grow lived another 23 years after what happened at Hollow Creek. He never talked about what he saw or heard in public again. He did tell a traveling minister who passed through Judkins Crossing in 1900, and that minister wrote it down in a personal note. Phesis died in his sleep in his cabin on the ridge in 1914. The next morning, his goats were found standing at the far edge of their pasture, facing the valley, and were completely still. If you believe the people who still live in the hills around Judkins Crossing, people who have been there long enough to know and respect the old stories, Phesis's last words, which were written in charcoal on the wall next to his bed, were 4 words that didn't make any sense. That's the story of what really happened at Hollow Creek Manor, or at least what can be told. The rest is written in the stone, in a language that no one has been able to read yet. If you know a story like this from a place in the world where the ground hums, the silence is too heavy, or the earth remembers things it shouldn't, please leave it in the comments. You never know what might come up. Stay safe and aware until then, and the next time you press your hand against a stone wall, listen. You might be shocked by what you hear. That's all for now. We'll see you in the next story.